Hello and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marissa Miller, and this presentation is for my capstone project at the CUNY School of Public Health. This project is an analysis of New York State's alcohol advertising restrictions and their alignment with the World Health Organization's recommendations to reduce alcohol-related harm. This study evaluates the scope, enforcement mechanisms, and public health impact of New York's alcoholic beverage control law in relation to WHO's evidence-based best buys. My capstone instructor was Professor Jeffrey Lazarus, and the submission date for this is December 8th, 2024. So here is the structure of this presentation. First, I'll present a brief overview of the project. Next, I'll present an introduction to the problem and why this is an issue for public health. Then I'll go into the methods section, the results, discussion, and lastly, the conclusion. To briefly summarize an overview of the project, the aim of this project was to evaluate New York State's implementation of WHO recommendations to either comprehensively restrict or ban alcohol advertising. I used a policy analysis framework to assess New York State's alcoholic beverage control law based on 3 criteria: the scope of restrictions, enforcement mechanisms, and public health impact. I determined that New York's alcohol advertising policies are 50% aligned with WHO recommendations, which reflects a partial approach. And this conclusion emphasizes the need for stronger, more comprehensive regulations, particularly in digital and social media. To introduce this topic, excessive alcohol consumption is a leading cause of preventable death, with 2.6 million deaths globally per year, an average of 178,000 deaths in the US per year, and an average of 8,093 deaths in New York State per year. Studies have established that there is a causal relationship between exposure to alcohol advertising and increased alcohol consumption among youth, and the WHO has identified a set of high-impact, cost-effective, and affordable policy solutions called the WHO Best Buys, and these are to reduce the harmful use of alcohol. One of the best buys is to implement comprehensive advertising restrictions or full bans on advertising to reduce exposure, protect public health, and lower alcohol-related harm. However, these restrictions have been difficult to implement in the U.S. due to constitutional protections of free speech, and this has resulted in reliance on self-regulation by the alcohol industry, which has proven ineffective. On the methods for this project, I used a policy analysis framework to compare New York's alcohol advertising restrictions with the WHO recommendations. The analysis focused on evaluating the alignment of New York's alcoholic beverage control law with WHO recommendations using 3 key criteria: the scope of restrictions, enforcement mechanisms, and public health impact. 6 key components of WHO recommendations were considered, and those are advertising across all media, content restrictions, sponsorship limits, placement restrictions, health warning labels, and bans on advertising. An evaluation of these 6 components was done, and presence or absence of each in New York State's alcoholic beverage control law was tallied, and a percentage score was calculated. I selected these 6 components because they represent key elements that WHO defines as part of comprehensive restrictions on alcohol advertising. The results I determined are that New York State meets 3 of the 6 components, achieving 50% alignment. The table lists out the 6 components and whether or not New York State implements each one of these. The state excels in content restrictions, sponsorship limits, and placement restrictions, such as restricting alcohol ads near schools. However, where it falls short is in regulating digital and social media, mandating health warning labels on alcohol ads, and comprehensively banning advertising across all media platforms. Enforcement mechanisms also face challenges due to resource limitations, and it was difficult to assess the effectiveness of these partial restrictions due to lack of specific impact data. To discuss the implications of these findings, the findings reveal that New York recognizes the impact of alcohol advertising but lacks comprehensive policies to mitigate harm effectively. And while partial restrictions provide some protection, they fail to address digital media, which is a critical channel targeting youth. Alcohol advertising has also historically targeted communities of color, and the findings of this study underscore that aligning with WHO recommendations, which emphasize comprehensive restrictions and robust enforcement, this could significantly reduce alcohol-related harm in New York State, especially among vulnerable populations such as youth and communities of color. Future research should examine the impacts of current policies and where these fall short, and they should quantify health outcomes of current policies so that necessary adjustments can be made. And lastly, any barriers to implementing stricter regulations should be identified by further research. In conclusion, New York State's alcohol advertising restrictions do show a partial alignment with WHO's comprehensive recommendations, but they are lacking in breadth and scope. To strengthen public health outcomes, the state should expand regulations to cover digital and social media, being a channel that is frequented by youth. The state should also enhance enforcement capacity and implement stricter advertising limits on other media channels. These measures align with global best practices and have the potential to reduce alcohol consumption and its associated harms. Regarding the limitations of this study, firstly, the impact of current advertising restrictions was difficult to assess due to lack of data, and this study also relied on publicly available information on enforcement by the New York State Liquor Authority, so it may not have captured a full picture of the State Liquor Authority's enforcement actions. And lastly, the percentage-based approach may not have fully captured the impact of New York State's partial measures. I'd like to thank Professor Lazarus and Tess Baldwin for their assistance and for providing invaluable feedback throughout the process of this project. I'd also like to thank Professor Crovero, who is my faculty advisor and second reader, for her comments and guidance on improving this project. And lastly, I'd like to thank all others who supported me with discussions that helped refine this research and this project. And thank you for your attention.